Time magazine a couple of weeks ago, the headline, the cover, "Is Truth Dead?" sums up the current political conversation in the United States, that's for sure. But I wonder if this cover could have been on the cover of the Jerusalem Times if there had been one at the time that Jesus was crucified and raised. Maybe would they have asked, "Is truth dead?" Our understanding of what is true today is based in the desire for provable and scientific facts. Anne Mansfield, who writes for the Washington Post, says, "Our current concept of truth is largely a product of the Enlightenment, when humans codified a way to state a question, pose a hypothesis, and collect observations that either supported or changed their understanding of the truth." The rise these days of the fact-checkers that seek to verify statements of politicians is born out of that same desire to verify what they are saying and to hold them accountable. And the fact-checkers are working hard these days with the rise of fake news, events and opinions simply made up as a figment of someone's imagination and then pushed out on social media. It's pretty alarming stuff. But Mansfield in the Washington Post goes on to say that Donald Trump and other leaders like him are operating, she thinks, in a different kind of world, a world based on emotional truth. She says you can quote facts all day to them and about them, and people will still believe them. Facts don't matter if the emotional impact is real. I think when I was at high school we had history lessons about this, and back then it was called propaganda. Today it's called fake news. So what about our Easter story then? What kind of truth is it? Could it be classified as fake news? The Matthew version of the gospel story that we read this year has all the political intrigue of Washington, D.C. On Good Friday, we finished the story with Pilate, who was the Roman governor, commanding that Jesus' tomb be guarded so that the body could not be stolen by his followers. The priests and the Pharisees were worried by what Jesus had said and were concerned that the disciples would make it look like he might have been raised from the dead. And so the tomb was sealed. In the other gospel stories, it's just a big heavy stone that's rolled in front of it, which would be secure enough. But in Matthew, the tomb is sealed, which makes Matthew's story the most dramatic of the gospels, because then it requires an earthquake to break it open again. In the other gospels, the stone is just rolled away before the women arrive. In Matthew's gospel, there's a massive earthquake to break it open and to greet the women. And there's an angel, and the poor guards who had been sent to guard it faint dead with fear. They can no longer see what is happening. Matthew places great emphasis on seeing. The women go to see the tomb, not to anoint the body like in the other stories. The angel says, "Come and see the place where he lay." And the angel also says they are going to see Jesus in Galilee. And then suddenly Jesus is there, and they see him and touch him. And he too promises that the disciples will see him back home in Galilee. It reads just like a fact checker. See here, see this, see for yourself. You can prove it with your own eyes. The story then carries on past what we read this morning, back to the political. Matthew says some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests everything that had happened. After the priests had assembled with the elders, they devised a plan to give a large sum of money to the soldiers, telling them, "You must say, 'His disciples came by night and stole him away while we were all asleep.' If this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and they did as they were directed. So you can change the story if necessary. You can keep things quiet by paying a few coins. The trouble is that Pilate and the Pharisees and the soldiers are dealing with the physical, visual aspects of the story. Matthew is writing about something else altogether. He's writing about seeing the world with the eyes of faith, seeing the world with God's eyes, if you like. Theologian Stanley Hauer says, of course we cannot see the resurrection because God cannot be seen. But we do see Jesus, who has been resurrected. Accordingly, the resurrection is the condition that now makes it possible for us to see truthfully all that is in God's creation. The resurrection is the condition that now makes it possible for us to see truthfully all that is in God's creation. The guards saw the empty tomb. The chief priests knew about the empty tomb, but that did not make them believers. The women saw Jesus, but women were not considered reliable witnesses in Jesus' day, so their word could not be relied upon. And yet all four Gospels agree it was the women who were the first witnesses to the resurrection. It's not a very reliable way to build a case. But the Gospel writers were not building a case for 21st century fact checkers. They were communicating a different kind of truth. Stanley Hauer again, he says the truth that is Jesus is a truth that requires discipleship. For it is only by being transformed by what he has taught and by what he has done that we can come to know the way the world is. It's a truth that requires discipleship. So Matthew was giving words and meaning to people's experiences, uncovering for them a truth that they already knew as followers, and now they needed to be able to pass on to others. Those in the next generation, who Peter was talking to in our reading from the Acts of the Apostles, those who had never met Jesus, would also now be included in the discipleship and follow too in the way of the resurrected one. Why? Because to do so, to follow, made a difference. It made a difference to the way they saw and experienced the world, and made a difference to their choices, to the way they lived. And this is where Pilate and the politics meets the story again. To be a follower of Jesus meant to see him as Lord. Not a term that we're very comfortable with here at St Matthew's because it sounds too hierarchical and too old-fashioned and too masculine. But to call Jesus Lord meant Caesar is not Lord. To call Jesus Lord meant that God's reign was more powerful than Caesar and his soldiers, and more powerful than Pilate, and more powerful than the corrupt religious leaders. Kate said in her Good Friday sermon that when Pilate washed his hands of Jesus and let him be crucified, that we see represented there in the story all the times that we look away from injustice in the world. Pilate washed his hands and looked away, and that represents all the times that we look away. To claim to see Jesus and to kneel at his feet and worship him is to see through the unjust politics of Jesus' time and our time to another way. So what kind of truth is this then? Is this just a first century version of fake news? Well, that is for you to decide and you to discern. What do you see when you look at your world and your life? Are you able to see hope? Are you able to see love? Are you able to see light in the midst of darkness? Faith does not remove the pain and sorrow from our world. Indeed, faith helps us to see the pain and the sorrow and the injustice and face them squarely. Resurrection is life overcoming death, hope overcoming despair, and love overcoming hate. But resurrection does not happen and cannot happen without there first being a death. In Jesus' case, a death of torture and suffering by a politically oppressive regime. So resurrection faith does not jump over the pain and sorrow to a Pollyanna world of sweetness and light. Resurrection faith is anchored in the real world, in war, in drought and famine, homelessness, climate change, chemical weapons, whatever's top of your list of the world's sorrows today. Resurrection faith faces these things head on and says love will not be overcome, hope will not be overcome. Jesus says to the woman, go to Galilee, go to the place we all lived and worked in, go to our home, and you will see me again. And you will know then what is your purpose, what is your work that is to be done. Today, Jesus says to us, go to Aotearoa, go to Auckland, or wherever you're from. See me there, where you are, in your life, in your work. Jesus says, see me there. And what will we see? Something that is real or just fake news? Each one of us is invited to make a choice. When we see the empty tomb, do we go for the cover-up story and remain silent? Or do we say, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia.